So she not only invites people into the White House, but she says, I'm going to take this on as a project and really make sure the White House is looking its best. So she does what's called a historic redecoration. So she's not just, putting in the new color she likes, but she's going through and finding things that had previously been like sold or taken out of the White House and bringing them back so that it has all of the historic significance that she thinks it should have. And then when she's done, she works with a TV channel to film what she's done and give like a tour of the White House with Jackie Kennedy. That tour of the White House, when it was on TV, it was watched by over 2 million people. People loved it. And for a lot of people, that was the only time they really got to see into the White House. And then not too long after Jackie Kennedy is Pat Nixon. So Pat Nixon starts hosting White House tours. And she notices there are some things about the tour that make it hard for certain people to experience it. One is there are steps that come into the White House. So she adds a ramp to the south entrance of the White House so that people who are in wheelchairs or people who just can't walk up steps are able to go on the tours as well. She also brings in some tour guides that speak different languages so that people who don't speak English can go on White House tours. And she gets an ASL interpreter to do tours as well. So she really expands the accessibility of the public tours of the White House. So while these first ladies, the ones that I went through there on the left, really found purpose in their role as hostess and caretaker to the White House, many first ladies really rejected this responsibility. So if we go back to our second first lady, Abigail Adams, she was extremely frustrated that her family would now become financially responsible for furnishing the president's home in Philadelphia. She believed the expense should be covered by the government. And so that's essentially what happens once they move into the White House in Washington, D.C. Then they received an appropriation to furnish the White House. And that's still true today. So many other aspects of this expectation have been formalized into paid jobs. So there's not too much pressure on the First Lady. So we have White House curators now, social secretaries, chief ushers, the National Park Service. They're all now responsible for like the bulk of this category of White House hostess. But even still, we see modern First Ladies hosting events, and the expectation remains especially strong around the holidays, especially Christmas, where you see a First Lady is always introducing how she's decorated the White House for Christmas. And that is the end of our first category, White House hostess. So now we're going to move on to activists. So being the person closest to the president certainly provides opportunity for activism. While many first ladies have been reluctant to get involved in politics, some were already activists and politicians in their own right when they came into the role. So they see being the first lady as a place for opportunity. So before her time as First Lady, Abigail Adams was in the unique position of being married to a man who was working on the foundational documents of our country. So when John Adams was in Philadelphia in 1776 at the Second Continental Congress, his wife is at home in Massachusetts, so they're writing letters back and forth to kind of update each other, ask how things are going. But she knows what he's doing there, that if they're working on the foundational documents. So she sees this as an opportunity to talk to him about what she thinks should be included in our new code of laws. So that is where this quote is from on the screen. It's one of her letters. Remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. So she was specifically talking about advocating for women's rights inside of marriage. And so while she is our first lady to advocate for women's rights, it becomes a pretty natural cause for many other first ladies to support. And one of those first ladies was Betty Ford. So you can see on her little date thing that she became First Lady in 1974. And this is going to be a pretty tumultuous year for her. So she becomes first lady when President Nixon resigns. So it's kind of by surprise, she's now lifted into this role when her husband becomes president. And then only a few months later, she is at a doctor's visit when it's discovered that she has a malignant tumor in her breast that needs immediate attention. So it was pretty shocking at the time that she chose to be really frank and open about what she was going through. So her frankness in sharing this really endeared her to the American public. And it's important to realize that at this time, breast cancer was not a common phrase that you would hear uttered on television. In fact, according to Texas A&M University, when it needed to be listed as a cause of death, it was often just called women's disease. So it's a pretty different time when she is just openly talking about this diagnosis and her treatment. And just by honestly sharing her story is how she becomes a breast cancer activist. And her willingness to share this experience with the world motivated others to get cancer screenings as well. So it's really impossible to know how many lives she saved by being honest and open about her process. But she did some more intentional advocacy too. So in the 70s, Betty Ford joined the rallying cry of many women across the country as she advocated for the passing of the Equal Rights Amendment. So in the 1970s, it seemed like the ERA was kind of gaining steam. It was first introduced in 1923, but by 1974, it seemed like it just needed a few little pushes to get it over the finishing line. So Betty Ford started working on that. She started calling the states that needed to ratify it still. So she called representatives from Arizona, Illinois, Missouri, North Dakota, Nevada, and Georgia. You can see from her desk here in the White House, she is making those calls. And she wanted to talk to people to tell them why she thought this was important. And she also gave a speech at the International Women's Year Conference in Cleveland, Ohio in 1975. So I have a short clip from that speech.
While many new opportunities are open to women, too many are available to the lucky few. Many barriers continue to block the paths of most women, even on the most basic issue of equal pay for equal work. And the contributions of women as wives and mothers continue to be underrated. This year is not the time to cheer the visible few, but to work for the invisible many, whose lives are still restricted by custom and code. In your working sessions of this conference, you will explore many of the formal and informal restrictions that confine women. Many of these restrictions spring directly from those emotional ideas about what women can do and should do. These definitions of behavior and ability inhibit men and women alike, but the limits on women have been formalized into law and structured into social custom. For that reason, the first important steps have been made to undo the laws that hem women in and lock them out of the mainstream of opportunities. But my own support of the Equal Rights Amendment has shown what happens when a definition of proper behavior collides with the right of an individual to personal opinions. I do not believe that being First Lady should prevent me from expressing my ideas.
So that's just a short clip from her speech. The whole speech is on YouTube on the Gerald Ford Presidential Library YouTube channel, if you're interested in watching it. But she was not the only First Lady to get involved in advocating for the ERA. You can see here in this next picture that she's joined by Rosalind Carter. So Rosalind Carter also used her position as First Lady to advocate for the passing of the ERA. Unfortunately, to Rosalind Carter and Betty Ford and their supporters, it was not passed, and it still has yet to be ratified. And then it would be impossible to talk about First Ladies as activists without mentioning, our most activist First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. So during her long tenure as First Lady, and you can see by the dates underneath her name, it was quite a long time, 1933 to 1945. She was a strong advocate of the issues she believed in, and being First Lady during the Great Depression and World War II gave her plenty of opportunities to speak up. She often supported labor movements, women's rights, civil rights, and refugee resettlement. And her reputation as someone who cared and someone who was passionate and always willing to help really caused a lot of people to reach out to her in their time of need. But one of those people was Walter White, who's pictured here with Eleanor Roosevelt. So he was the president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People from 1929 to 1955. And so White reached out to the First Lady quite a bit. And one particular thing, it was in hopes to help her convince her husband to support the Costigan-Wagner Act. So that was a bill that would have made lynching a federal hate crime. And White and the First Lady had a long correspondence with frequent meetings about this. And she was a supporter of the bill. What White really wanted was for Eleanor Roosevelt to talk to her husband to get him to publicly back the bill. He thought that would help get it through Congress. So that is what Eleanor Roosevelt did. She had frequent meetings with her husband trying to encourage him to support the bill openly. She even surprised Franklin Roosevelt with a meeting with Walter White. One day, Franklin Roosevelt came home and he found Eleanor Roosevelt, Walter White, and his mother, Sarah Delano, sitting on a porch waiting for him to return so that they could all meet with him about his support. Unfortunately, her advocacy did not get her husband to back the bill, and the bill was not passed. But Eleanor Roosevelt continued to be an advocate against racial discrimination and violence for years to come. But that didn't make her particularly popular with a lot of people. And while it's easy to look back and admire First Ladies that stood up for what they believed in and what they believed to be right, it's important to remember that their activism was not always embraced. Eleanor Roosevelt now ranks as like one of the most popular First Ladies and one of the most popular American women in history in general. People often list her as their most influential or an inspiring woman. But there was fierce contemporary opposition to her advocacy, so much so that she would often receive death threats. So she traveled with a pistol, and you can see here on this image is a gun license for her from 1957. And then on the other side is a little pin that says, "We don't want Eleanor either." So when Franklin Roosevelt was running for president again on his last term, there was a strong backlash against her as well, that they didn't like President Roosevelt, but they didn't like her equally. And that was also true for Betty Ford and Rosalind Carter. So when they were advocating for the ERA, there was an equal push against them as well. You can see here in these signs that Rosalind Carter is mentioned a few times, and I think 3 of them by name or by title. So they're specifically telling her that they don't want the ERA. There were similar protests during Betty Ford's time in the White House. Then the signs were "Put down the phone, Betty," because people knew that she was calling to advocate on behalf of the ERA. But is it okay for the First Lady to be an activist Would your feelings about their activism differ if they were advocating for a cause you were against? Although the First Lady is not a politician, it would be silly to argue that they are in the same position of other private citizens. They have connections, influence, and a lot of things beyond most politicians and public figures themselves. So where is the line between advocacy and public office? When we vote for a presidential candidate, are we giving them pay for their spouses to advocate for their political beliefs as well? So our third category is celebrity. So this may have been one of the most unintentional roles, and the very first women to find themselves married to the President of the United States had no idea how strong public interest would be in them. So on our trip from Mount Vernon, Virginia to New York City, Martha Washington could not believe that there were people recognizing her at every stop. She even wrote to one of her family members, "It seems I am a great somebody." When some relished the spotlight, like Dolley Madison seemed unbothered by our nickname, Queen Dolly, and Harriet Lane did so well being the hostess for her uncle, President Buchanan, that she may have been the first lady to be called First Lady. But other first ladies found the attention probably annoying at best and frightening and dangerous at worst. So if we go back to one of the first ladies we mentioned before, Frances Cleveland, she married Grover Cleveland while he was president. They actually got married in the White House. She was the only first lady to do that. And she was only 21 years old when she married him. So people kind of became obsessed with her. And they had photographs taken, like the one you're seeing on the left there of her in her bridal gown. And because of like the ability to see who she actually was in this photograph, you know, it's not a portrait, you can actually see her face, people began to recognize her in a way that wasn't possible before. And this caused a lot of concern for President Cleveland. He did not want his wife subjected to the stress of being a public figure. But he was not the only one to notice her skyrocketing popularity. So merchants and retailers began noticing too. And to capitalize on her fame, people began adding her image to products without her permission. So without probably her knowledge either, her image was being added to advertise tobacco pipes, sewing kits, candy, and even medicine. So you can see on the left side of the screen there, there's a Sparks Perfect Health for kidney and liver. So this was pretty shocking to them, very upsetting to President Cleveland as well. And he objected about the morality of this, but unfortunately it was legal at the time. But this outrageous practice was likely not the most shocking consequence of Frances Cleveland's fame. So when she moved back into the White House, so this is the second term, the second non-consecutive term, she returned with children. So one of those children was a little baby. And then people were, you know, obsessed with the baby like they were with Frances Cleveland. And also during this time, the White House lawn was open to the public. So all of these factors combined to create a pretty terrifying incident for Frances. So from a window on the second floor of the White House, she was looking out as a nurse pushed the new baby around in the carriage, and visitors were stopping by to see the baby, to smile at the baby. But one of those visitors stopped a little longer, and then they reached into the carriage and took out the baby. So this had to be terrifying for Frances Cleveland as she's watching from the window on the second floor of the White House, unable to do anything as someone, a stranger, has grabbed her baby out of the baby carriage. And then they held the baby for a little bit and they put the baby back and just kind of walked away. So after that, Frances Cleveland decides she doesn't want to live in the White House anymore. And they move to another house where they spend most of their time and just returning to the White House for their duties that they have to do there. But understandably, she really doesn't want her family there. And if there's anyone who can understand the plight of Frances Cleveland, as probably her 20th century counterpart, Jackie Kennedy. So Jackie Kennedy, just like the Clevelands, became a national obsession. And similar to Frances Cleveland, Jackie Kennedy really prioritized being a mother over all of her other First Lady expectations. So you can see there's this quote from her: "If you bungle raising your children, I don't think whatever else you do matters very much." So that shows where her priority was, and it was on her children. And it must be a kind of jarring reality to suddenly have your children become some of the most famous people in the world. And when First Lady Michelle Obama was waving to the crowd after her husband's victory speech in 2008, her thoughts slowly went to her children, and she wondered, what have we done to them? Public attention is not always positive, and no First Lady could know this more than Mary Lincoln. So throughout her time in the White House, there were frequent reports about her unstable behavior. And unbeknownst to her husband, Mary Lincoln was in debt to about $70,000. She had purchased on credit furniture, clothing, other household accessories that she felt were necessary to keep up the appearances as First Lady of the United States. And she believed she'd have more time while still in the White House to settle these debts. But President Lincoln was assassinated, as we know. And the overwhelming grief of losing her husband must have been compounded by knowing that now she was in trouble with these debts as well. So when she was out of the White House, the mounting pressure caused her to attempt to sell her wardrobe with the help of her dressmaker, Elizabeth Keckley, who's pictured there on the right. So together, the two women went to New York City and tried to make secret arrangements to sell the garments. But it was not long before her secret was out and Mary Lincoln was humiliated. She had already had a reputation as being impulsive and irresponsible, but now now the press had the sensational proof that those things they were saying were true. And the selling of her dresses combined with her letters to Congress begging for an appropriation left her with a negative legacy that still lasts until today. And while it's true that Mary Lincoln made poor financial decisions while in the White House, who among us could emotionally manage having their most shameful secret printed for the country to read? And despite the potential terrible consequences of being a famous First Lady, the celebrity status of First Ladies has only continued to grow. So we're going to take a look here on the next slide with some of the fame of our most recent First Ladies compared to other celebrities and other institutions. So you can see even after they leave the White House, they are really celebrities for the rest of our life. I mean, even compared to the official White House Instagram account with 7 million followers, you can see there's a First Lady, Michelle Obama, who has significantly more than that. So really, there's no escaping the fame for First Ladies. So all the different expectations and roles I've talked to you so far about are not clear dividing line categories. A First Lady is not a hostess one day and then an activist another day. They're overlapping responsibilities, but for many First Ladies, especially modern First Ladies, all roads lead back to being a political partner. So our first political power couple may have been Dolley and James Madison. So Dolley had learned about the traditions of her predecessors, Martha and Abigail Adams. She learned about the receptions. She even asked to be updated about what was happening when Martha Washington was First Lady, because she felt she needed to learn about this process. But Dolley's receptions expanded on the ones done before her. Instead of hosting as like a quiet, subservient partner like Martha Washington, or like an intellectual partner like Abigail Adams, she chose to be kind of vocal, flamboyant, and strategic. So every Wednesday, Dolley Madison would host drawing room receptions. She was intentionally forging social networks. So it wasn't just a party, it was a party with a purpose. She would expand the guest list. She invited women and men of more than just the upper social classes. And there was even less formality at these gatherings than the ones held by Martha and Abigail Adams. Instead of seating charts, everyone kind of just gathered in the room together, like you see in this painting, and they mixed casually. So in that way, not only were the guests mixing, but so were Dolley and James Madison. So they would work together in this strategy. And James Madison seemed to have a better understanding than the presidents that came before him of what could be accomplished at these events. So he intended and he used them as an opportunity to kind of like test the waters on issues. Once it was clear that James Madison was going to move on a particular issue, Dolley Madison became like the lobbyist. So one conversation at a time, she could persuade all of Washington, D.C. So many first ladies have embraced the strategy of Dolley Madison by trying their activism to supporting their husband's political goals. So we can see that in some of our modern first ladies like Pat Nixon, who hosted a ton of volunteer cleanup events as the Clean Water Act was making its way through Congress. We also have Lady Bird Johnson that met with school children as President Johnson advocated for the passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Then Lou Hoover, she made a ton of radio broadcasts that really encouraged charitable donations and volunteering as to aid the suffering during the Great Depression, as President Hoover kind of discouraged the need for federal aid to individuals. And then Nancy Reagan here, who did her Just Say No campaign as the Reagan administration expanded the war on drugs with the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. So in this way, first ladies have used their position to softly advocate for many of the same positions and goals as the president. But where we really start to see first ladies as presidential partners is during campaigns. So if we go all the way back to the campaign of 1896, we can see Ida McKinley here seated next to her husband, William McKinley, during his front porch campaign. So this was kind of an accidental campaign partner situation that people just saw her there as McKinley was giving his speeches, and they wanted to know more about her. So because of that, the campaign released a biography on Ida. And that was the first time really a biography on a presidential candidate's spouse was released. They also released campaign buttons with her face on it. But in 1964, Lady Bird Johnson took on a challenge unlike other first lady before her. She was going to hit the campaign trail alone, so without her husband. So this is the first time a first lady is campaigning without her husband by her side. So this is 1964. It's right after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and she wanted to speak directly to the people of the South to encourage them to support her husband in the upcoming presidential election. So Lady Bird Johnson and her team, which is almost all a team of women, planned a 1,648-mile whistle-stop train tour. So it went through 8 states, over 40 stops. And after planning the route, the next task was to call all the local politicians and governors at each stop. So Lady Bird Johnson herself personally called each person. It took her 8 hours. And her press secretary noticed that when she called, she seemed to have a slightly thicker accent than normal, but this was all part of her strategy. She really wanted to be a Southern woman talking to Southern voters. So some politicians were interested in meeting with her during her trip and excited about the South being a focal point in the campaign, and others were a little more hesitant. Some politicians, even fellow Democrats, wanted to distance themselves from the president and the new civil rights legislation. And this was certainly not an easy trip. Her group experienced jeers and taunts. There was even a bomb threat against the train. But she knew that the reception to her would be different than the reception to her husband. She had an advantage and an opportunity to speak to people that would be willing to listen to her rather than her husband. And then at its final stop, when the train rolled into New Orleans, the Lady Bird special was joined by President Johnson. And there he spoke to the crowd, and it was clear that this had been a success. So while this was the first time a First Lady went out on her own and campaigned, it was certainly not the last. First spouses are now expected to be a part of the presidential candidates team. In fact, it's hard to even imagine a person running for president without a spouse supporting them. And you see at the bottom there some pins that have come through the years supporting first ladies. So as we have learned, the role of first lady has many expectations that some first ladies have been able to meet and some have not. And the success or failure of a first lady is often based upon their ability to meet public expectations. So the role has certainly changed over the years, but it's provided us with fascinating examples of first ladies' attempts to navigate a public versus private role. They've often been torn between being a political figure, a social hostess, a celebrity, and an activist. There's been tons of criticism and controversy around them and their husbands. And the role of First Lady is complex and ever-changing. It always offers us a fascinating window into the expectations of American women. So now, if anyone has questions, I would be happy to take some. Okay, I see a question. Will you collect memorabilia from a first spouse at Vila in the future, or just continue with first ladies? Ooh, so I think we would definitely collect memorabilia from a first spouse. You know, if there is a first spouse that's not a man, or I should say when there is, we would definitely collect stuff from them. Yeah, I think that's an important part of the story. I think it would be really interesting to see how the expectations change if there was a first spouse that was a man compared to what we expect of first ladies now. Also, the person that asked the question, you called us Philo. That makes me think that you are a Park Service person since you know our alpha code. Please tell us about the museum. Sure. So we are located in Canton, Ohio. We have 2 buildings. So one of them is the historic Saxon House. So it was home to Ida and William McKinley, but it's her family home because her maiden name was Saxon. So we do guided tours of the house. And then we have our education center where we have rotating exhibits about other first ladies. So those exhibits are done by our partner organization, National First Ladies Library. So every 6 months to a year, they change everything out and put out new things for people to see. So that's the way that we try to interpret all of the first ladies. Yeah, we have gotten comments that we might someday have to change our name to be first spouse. Yeah, but it hasn't happened yet. So we're just holding on to first lady so far.